It's 76 with second 588. And what it says is an exception to this rule exists where a defendant's motion is necessitated by prosecutorial impropriety designed to avoid an acquittal. Now, what has happened in this morning was two times. The state had commented on Mr. Rittenhouse's right to remain silent. The first time he was admonished by the court. The second time the court had the jury leave and re-admonished him on that. Prior to Mr. Rittenhouse testifying, this court addressed various things with, you had various statutes, and then you had asked if that anything would be coming up on, for example, I think 90608. One of the other things you addressed was 90404. And you had said that based on the information that had come out at the trial, nothing had changed as it relates to your ruling. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Binger stated, and we looked it up, previously, he said to Mr. Rittenhouse, previously indicated that you wish to have your AR-15 to protect someone's property. Clearly in violation not only of the prior ruling that you had made, but the ruling that very day, that very morning. Elements the court must consider when making a determination mistrial for what amounts to prosecutorial. And the first one is prosecutor's actions must be intentional in the sense of a culpable state of mind in the nature of awareness that his activity would be prejudicial to the defendant. I would argue to you that that's clearly aware of that. You had warned him, you had told him prior to Mr. Rittenhouse testifying that these things, certainly the 90404 was off limits. You had warned him about the infringement on his constitutional right to remain silent. Again, the second one I think requires some action by the court in terms of a finding. The second one says the prosecutor's actions was designed allow another chance to convict. That is to kick the cat because the first trial is going badly, or to prejudice the defendant's rights to successfully complete a confrontation at the first trial. Now, the case that I had cited is a Kenosha case, State versus Coping.
Opening?
Yep. 100 with second 700.
COPENING?
Yes, sir. In that case, the court didn't make findings regarding the prosecutor's actions. So I don't know that it's my role to sit here and say who's winning. That's necessarily what I'm supposed to do. But I think the court has to make some findings to the bad faith on the part of the prosecution. And if the court makes a finding that the actions that I had talked about were done in bad faith, then I think both elements for mistrial with prejudice have been met. And I think under the circumstances, based on what I put forth on the record, I would certainly ask the court to consider those. And I would ask the court grant the motion with prejudice. Thank you.
Thank you. State?
Your Honor, I would like an opportunity to more fully respond to this with a little bit of research. At first blush, though, and I reserve the right to present case law and additional sites to the court, but I do want to point out for the record that the defendant has presented interviews to at least one media source and at least one online source since his arrest. And there have been questions about that night. There have been questions about what he did, things like that. He has decided, probably on circumstances, not to give a statement in the media about what happened, But he is talking about his family life, he's talking about his friends, he's talking about the circumstances of the case, he's talking about how this has affected him and things like that. So my point in asking those questions was, you have agreed to talk to the media, you've agreed to talk about yourself, you've agreed to get interviews, but until now, this is the first time you're explaining your actions. And so I wasn't referring to his in-custody statements. In fact, I never asked either detective about what the defendant told them. He actually starts to tell them some things, and then he says he wants a lawyer, and they stop him. They Mirandize him first, by the way. Then he starts to tell them some things, and he says, but I want to talk to my lawyer. And they're like, okay, we're done. So I'm not referring to that. I didn't ask any questions of the detectives about that. But since this, the defendant has spoken to the media. He has talked about his life, about circumstances related to this case. He just hasn't given his exact version of events that night. So his voluntary discussion to speak to the media has nothing to do with the Fifth Amendment. That is his decision. If he's going to pick and choose what he wants to talk about, voluntary interviews with the media, then I think that's fair game. It doesn't implicate his Miranda rights. It doesn't implicate the Fifth Amendment. He's making his own voluntary choice.
Well, wait a minute. You don't think he could give an interview about his awards he won in high school, or his demerits that he got, or his and about his sports activities and his swimming and that, and declined to answer any questions about the incident in question, and that somehow a waiver of his right of silence?
I think he's doing more than that, Your Honor, in these interviews.
I don't know. I knew nothing about them. I never, I haven't seen I haven't seen probably 1% of all the evidence, which is pretty typical, as you know. So I have no way of knowing it. You have some interviews that he gave to media or to whatever?
Yeah, there's an interview that we're looking at on our computer right now from the Washington Post, where he talks to them. I know this one, I think it's either the New Yorker or the GQ maybe. He speaks to the reporters also. And he doesn't go into specific details about what happened that night, but it's not like it's talking about school or swimming or things like that.
No. Don't leave it at, he doesn't go into specific details. I mean, it's certainly there could be a waiver about the activities of that night. And if you're suggesting that occurred, that could make a big difference. But even a small discussion on his part of the night in question might be a full waiver. I don't know, but I won't know until I see it. But why don't you make copies of it and.
Can we have a few minutes to
Well, we won't do it right now. I do agree with you that this is not something that I would want to do sitting here without giving you an opportunity to respond. Although I would be interested in your preliminary response to the excluded evidence that you touched on after having been told not to do it, or having been told that I was confirming my prior rulings.
I do want to just point out right now, we've got it on the screen. This is a Washington Post article, and there's reference to an interview that he says, the defendant says he did not regret having his gun because, quote, I would have died that night if I didn't, end quote. That's a direct quote from the defendant to the media about that night.
What about that?
Your Honor, all I can say about that interview is there were prior counsel representing him.
I don't care about that.
Well,
Well, that might make a difference.
But if I could just summarize. I did hear you talk about that evidence this morning before. He admitted that he had said to the person in the yellow pants that he had pointed the gun at that person. I have seen that video. It was actually introduced by the defense. I think it was even in their opening statement. And there's this person who confronts the defendant and accuses him of this. Frankly, to be honest, Your Honor, when I watched the video the first time, I didn't hear the defendant's reaction. I thought it was someone making an accusation and then the defendant walking away as if trying to avoid a confrontation. I was surprised to hear the defendant admit in his testimony, on direct, by his attorney, that yes, I did tell that person that I had pointed the gun at them. He explained then that he was joking when he said that. The jury can evaluate that. It goes to his credibility. It goes to whether or not he's telling the truth. It goes to his decision-making. That is, again, this is an incident that occurred that night, so it's not something that happened separate in time. It presumably happened a few minutes before. But like I said, I was taken aback.
Who thinks they'll find the boy guilty?
That he had said to this person.
This is
yes,
not
when
live.
I
I am playing this only
I
until
think
live
it's
feed
fair
comes
to say
back.
that watching that video, that person, believes strongly that this happened, and is telling him it happened. Now the defendant today is giving us a different version and saying, "Oh, I made it. I was joking. I was just kidding that guy or whatever." I'd like to probe that. I'd like to probe what he said to that person. I'd like to probe what his motivations were, etc. I'd like to probe whether, in fact, he really did do that. And I think that changes the equation with regard to the CDS video that was the subject of the other acts motion. Because in my mind, it is very similar. And I know we've disagreed on that, and I'm not going to belabor the point, Your Honor, but that was where I was coming from, was there's been a change in the testimony of the defendant today. Makes that evidence. It's admissible and much more relevant than it already was, and I thought it was already relevant. And the court is, I do want to be clear
So
also.
I'm just here on the sidelines, just
Well,
yeah, I had made a ruling that the evidence wasn't coming in, and you decided that it was.
if I could just
He should be
respond to that,
found not
say,
guilty and a mistrial filed where they cannot retrial it.
absolutely. We've had 3 state motions in limine. There was one in which we asked the court to introduce. There was,
Don't get into other subjects. Come on, what you're telling me, you're an experienced trial attorney, and you're telling me that when the judge says, I'm excluding this, you just to take it upon yourself to put it in because you think that you found a way around it? Come on.
if I may finish, Your Honor, I was about to say, your ruling on our 3 motions and other acts motions was, there were some gradations there. That you were clear that some things were absolutely out, other things.
He is trying to provoke a mistrial because he knows he's done fucked it up.
Clearly, I know this is
And that-
out, but you left the door open on other things. So I didn't interpret your ruling as this is absolutely never.
If you ask me, that judge is for Cal, which he should
I
be.
have filed other acts motions before you. Your practice oftentimes is to reserve ruling on those until you see the evidence. And I think you even said something to that effect at our motion.
I undoubtedly did.
So I thought, this is my good faith explanation to you, and if you want to yell at me, you can. My good faith feeling this morning after watching that testimony was you had left the door open a little bit. Now we had something new, and I was going to.
There better not be another incident. I'll take the motion under advisement. And you can respond. When you say that you were acting in good faith, I don't believe that. In good faith. All right. Would you come up, please, Mr. Rittenhouse?
I do have,
Yeah.
Your Honor,
Yeah.
I do have another item that I want to raise before the jury comes in and raise it with you. There was another acts motion with regard to the defendant being at Pudgy's Bar after a court appearance in January, which he poses for selfies with a shirt free as fuck. I would like to ask the defendant if he posed for selfies after a court appearance with members of the public wearing that shirt. I do not intend to talk about who those people were, what groups they were affiliated with, or anything along those lines. But I believe that it is relevant when the defendant goes to a bar after a court appearance and poses for selfies wearing a shirt like that. I think it is relevant to some of the issues that have come up in this case. For example, is remorse or lack of remorse, is utter disregard for human life. Those are things that I think it comes into play, because I think that behavior is not consistent with someone who has a regard for human life. The jury's already watched him break down on the stand with emotion. I'd like to probe how heartfelt and sincere these emotions are when you go to a bar and you pose for selfies with people, when you're out on bond in a first-degree intentional homicide trial wearing a free as fuck shirt. So, as I said, I want to use the photograph. I'm not going to talk about any of the people or who they were from. In fact, the photograph I'm going to use, we'll just see the defendant standing with a group of people for a selfie with that shirt on. That's as far as I want to go.
Handle this issue.
Nobody got an opportunity. First of all, you've made a ruling on it, and it was clear prior to him testifying. So part of this would have raised it. Would we have brought it up if we would have known that it was going to be coming in? We have done not. There's been nothing to open this door, Judge. Nothing that has been said to open the door about what happened 4 months after this is relevant in any way to what happened that evening. That is part of what the court had ruled. You had said 4 months after. I don't see how that goes to any 90404 type of admissible evidence. So my argument is, A, you ruled on it previous to him testifying. You confirmed your ruling, which you had made previously, where Mr. Binger just said you had shut the door on it. So apparently he doesn't believe a door that is shut should stay shut. However, now he's asking that something be admitted that, to be fair, this should have been brought up sooner. This jury, I did the voir dire, I would have voir dired on an issue of whether or not they heard it, saw it, were aware of it, how they felt about it, whether it had an impact on their ability to be fair in the case. We never went there because of your prior ruling. So there's nothing that's opened this door, and I don't think it's relevant, something that happened 4 months later. He talks about indifference to human life. That's that night, not 4 months later. There's nothing that's relevant about that. You've already made your ruling. I ask that you stick with it.
I'm struggling with why it would be relevant to any of the issues in this case. If he were on trial for using exquisitely bad judgment, if he were on trial for behaving in a very offensive way, then I could see the purpose. But an incident that occurred 4 months after the incidents in question, I don't see how that jury can work with that in reaching any conclusions about the issues in this case.
First of all, Your Honor, we have introduced evidence that the defendant had a slogan on his TikTok page, "Bro, I'm just trying to be famous." This case has made him famous, and he's posing for selfies as a result. One of our theories of this case is that his behavior that night was intended to gain attention, to be famous, and he's reaped the benefits of that. Second of all, he is on trial, in my opinion, for exquisitely poor decision-making. Taking a gun that he's not legally entitled to have, coming down in violation of the curfew, running around the community with that gun, trying to be a police officer when he's not, confronting protesters that he knows are hostile, and all of those behaviors, I think, are exquisitely bad judgment. So the jury can make that decision. The jury can give what weight they want to this evidence, but it's moments after he has a court appearance here. He's out on bond in this case when he decides to do this behavior, and nobody made him do it. Nobody forced him to go to the bar. Nobody forced him to wear the shirt. Nobody forced him to pose for selfies. It's his own decision making.
When I made reference to exquisitely poor judgment, I was talking about at the incident when he was wearing the shirt. Because everybody in all of humanity at one time or another displays bad judgment. sometimes exquisitely bad judgment. And we don't let it into people's trials on unrelated matters. So I wasn't referring to his having had good or bad judgment on the day in question. That's a legitimate inquiry, and you're being allowed to present a lot of evidence on that subject. And the jury is going to be instructed on in some of the element of some of the crimes that are charged here is going to deal with the caliber of his judgment. But you're talking about an incident that occurred 4 months later. So I'm not seeing it, and I don't want to waste any more time with it. I don't think that I've ruled before it's not admissible, and I have heard nothing to change my mind about that.
It was sought to be admitted earlier for a different purpose, Your Honor.
I'm sorry.
It was sought to be admitted earlier for a different purpose than it is today. The court has ruled that it can't be admitted for the prior purpose, but I'm seeking to introduce it for a different purpose today.
And that request is denied.
Thank you.
Okay? Are we ready to go?
So many things in this case the prosecutor did wrong. It's almost, I see it almost impossible that they hand down a guilty verdict. I don't see it happening. And if they do, guys, then everybody in America is already waking up to our system being corrupt and broken. But I strongly believe that if they plead this man guilty, this young man guilty, when he was clearly defending his life, it's just going to prove to everyone else who ain't awake yet that the system is fucking broken.
Good afternoon, folks, and I've sustained the objection to the last, so let's proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rittenhouse.
Good afternoon.
You testified earlier that there were times that evening when Mr. Rosenbaum had threatened you. Is that right?
Yes.
And you described him as wearing a red shirt with a blue bandana. Is that correct?
At certain,
Threatened you, that's what he was wearing?
I believe the first time he threatened me, he was wearing a red shirt with the blue bandana. The second time, he had it wrapped around his face.
Had what wrapped around his face?
His t-shirt.
So he wasn't wearing a shirt the second time around?
Correct.
And you indicated at one point you thought he had a chain in his hand?
I believe so.
When he made the threat to you with the red shirt on and the blue bandana, did he have the chain in his hand?
I think one of the times he did.
Okay, and so which of the times was it?
I can't recall off the top of my head. I think it was the time when He was threatening to cut his hearts out.
And I don't need to know the threat, I just need to know which time it was. Was it the first time or the second time?
Second time, the second time,
What was he wearing the second time?
he was masked. Well, the shirt wrapped around his face.
And he didn't have a shirt on his torso.
Correct.
And you could see when he didn't have a shirt, gun tucked in his waistband, correct?
I wasn't paying attention to that. I was behind Joanne Fiedler. I was somewhere over there.
So how far away were you from Mr. Rosenbaum when he made the second threat?
By 10, 15 feet. I'm not really certain.
But you were close enough to hear the words out of his mouth.
Yes.
And you took that as a threat to you personally?
I took the first one where he said, if I catch you alone, I'm going to kill you. I took that as a threat to me personally. The second time, I took that as a threat to the group.
Can we have that photo, exhibit 138 up on the screen, please? Do you see Mr. Rosenbaum in this picture?
I do.
And he's in the middle of the picture wearing the red shirt with the blue bandana, carrying the plastic bag, correct?
Yes.
Is that the way he looked when he made the first threat to you?
When he said, if I catch you alone, yes.
And he was carrying that plastic bag with him when he made that threat too, first threat to you.
Close. I couldn't give you an exact estimate, but he was close, less than 5 feet.
So closer than Madam Court Reporter is to you now?
I'd say about the same, if not a little bit closer.
And you were next to Mr. Balch when that was said?
Correct.
Was anyone else there besides you, Mr. Balch, and Mr. Rosenbaum?
I believe there were other demonstrators around.
And you've seen in this trial that there's been a lot of video footage of that night, correct?
Yes.
And you've seen in this trial that there's a lot of video footage of you that night, correct?
Yes.
You'd agree with me that there's no video of either one of these threats, correct?
I don't know if somebody filmed it that I'm aware of right now.
You're not aware of any, are you?
I'm not.
So Mr. Rosenbaum looked like that at the time of the first threat, but then looked different at the time of the second threat. Is that right?
Yes.
And did you say he was carrying the chain when he made the first threat or the second one?
The second.
And he was still carrying that plastic bag the second time?
Yes.
That plastic bag has a clear side to it that allows you to see inside of it, right?
Sorta. I didn't really look into the bag.
So you didn't know what was in the bag at all?
I didn't.
Did he swing the chain at you when he made the second threat?
He did not.
Did he physically touch you when he made the second threat?
No, he didn't.
In fact, that entire evening, he never once touched your body, did he?
He grabbed my gun when he attacked me.
And that's why I asked the question the way I did. He never touched your body that night, correct?
He didn't touch me physically.
And neither the first or the second time did he run at you or charge at you or anything like that, did he?
He didn't chase me.
He didn't even do anything, said some words.
Yes.
And that chain that he had in his hand, he never did anything to physically threaten you with that chain, correct?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And other than the chain that you've described, at no point in the evening did you ever see Joseph Rosenbaum, correct?
Not that I saw.
Never saw him with a gun,
Correct.
never saw him with a knife,
Correct.
never saw him with a bat,
Correct.
never saw him with a club.
Correct.
How far apart in time were these two threats that you say Mr. Rosenbaum made to you?
I want to say, I can't give you a definite time. I wasn't looking at my clock, but I'd say within the same hour.
And both of those threats occurred while you were on the 59th Street property?
The, the second threat happened at the corner, and the first threat happened towards Ruther Central High School.
Okay, could you use that laser pointer and point out on that map where the first threat occurred?
The first threat happened right here in front of the building.
So you're pointing at a location that is by the 59th Street car source on the south side of that property, along the building and Sheridan Road on the west side of the road. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And you said there was a second threat within an hour after that, correct?
Yes.
Where was that threat at?
It was somewhere over here, I remember, like on the other side of the property towards Ruther Central.
More towards the northeast corner of that same property.
Correct.
But you were still on the car source property when that second threat was allegedly made, correct?
Yes.
Did you remember what Mr. Rosenbaum had said to you later on when he's confronting you at the 63rd Street car source?
I took a picture of his face. When he said those threats, I recognized that was him that said that when he started chasing me.
So when you are running away from him at the 63rd Street car source, you're thinking to yourself, this is the guy who had made a threat to me earlier. Is that fair to say?
I was thinking this is the guy that said if he catches me alone, he'll kill me. As I'm running away from him.
The reason I asked Mr. Rittenhouse is, how did you know it was the same guy when he's changed the way he looks?
His appearance, the shorts, his height.
But in both of those instances that you've described, he's got something covering his face, either the blue bandana in one instance or the red shirt in a different instance, correct?
He was wearing the red shirt when he chased me around his head.
So you remember that from the second time that you say he threatened you.
Yes.
And you thought to yourself, this is the same guy.
Yes.
So when you eventually were getting to the point where you're going down to the 63rd Street car source, right before the shooting, you recognized him as you're following down the street, didn't you?
I didn't follow Mr. Rosenbaum down the street.
He was in front of you. You know that now, right?
I know that now.
But you didn't see him ahead of you as you're walking down there that night?
No, it was dark out.
But you, at some point as you get close to the 63rd Street car source, start running towards that lot, right?
Towards the fire that in the Duramax.
And Mr. Rosenbaum is running ahead of you, isn't he?
I don't believe so.
But you decided you needed to run because of the fire in the Duramax?
Yes.
Why? What was so urgent?
It was a fire.
There's fires all over the place, so?
I was getting to the fire to put it out.
We'll get back to that in a second. You indicated that while you were at the 59th Street car source, you said you put out a fire at the church next door. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you hear Joanne Fiedler's testimony yesterday that when you guys went over there, somebody had put some sort of flammable liquid on the door? Did you hear that testimony?
I did. I believe that was referring to the Ruther Central High School.
Okay, so when she described it as happening at the church, you think she was getting it confused?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So whatever happened with this flammable liquid on the door, the point is some other group, some other people put that out before you even got there.
Correct.
Why did you feel that you should go around off the 59th Street car source property and put out fires?
To make sure my community didn't get burnt down and help.
And when you say your community,